Is it ethical to punch a Nazi? On this episode of The Gray Zone. Hello, listeners and fellow conversationalists. This is Lauren, and welcome back to The Gray Zone. Today, we are joined by Amalia, Gray, and Juliet, and they are going to be doing their redemption episode for the case to punch a Nazi. I'll let you guys take it away.
Hi, so my name is Amalia, and Gray, Juliet, and I have talked about this case at length already, so we've got a lot of opinions and things to share about it.
Hello, I'm Gray. This is one of our favorite cases to talk about in class. We had a lot of very deep discussions with a lot of different perspectives, but again, we never got to present it in competition, and so this is our chance to almost have a second second coming of this episode.
So, hi, I'm Juliet, and we can start by giving some background to this case. So, essentially, a few years back, Richard Spencer, a well-known member of the alt-right, some have described him as a neo-Nazi. He describes himself as peaceful, which I believe is it's in stark contrast to the rest of his ideology. You know, he promotes creating a quote peaceful ethnic cleansing. He wants to create a
white ethno-state.
Yes, so obviously his tactics are quite exclusionary, violent, and dangerous to the population. But a few years back, was it an Antifa activist or just an activist?
Unknown assailant is how he's described.
Okay, so an unknown assailant punched Richard Spencer in the face in the middle of an interview. And so the main question here is that an ethical thing to do? Is it ethical to punch a Nazi? And that kind of boils down to the use of violence as a means of protest, and if that's ever appropriate.
Yeah. In the case, the problem is about whether or not violence should be used or can be used when in response to a political view that one disagrees with or finds objectionable. And that was really our first point of disconnect, was because we don't really believe, first of all, that white supremacist ideology amounts to a political view. We think that a political view involves things like whether or not taxes should be lowered, or how where the next road is going to build in your town, or healthcare or something like that. But when it comes to a violent and dangerous ideology, we think that goes far beyond the political views that this case might be referring to. So it's not really the same kind of problem at all.
Yeah, this case brings up a number of almost false equivalencies. One in equating violence, physical violence, mental violence, systemic or governmental violence, with what happened in the case of the unknown assailant punching Richard Spencer. But it also brings up this interesting question of what counts as a political misunderstanding or a political opinion that one can have. And we really looked to James Baldwin in describing this disconnect that we all felt best. He said, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." So we would believe that an ideology that denies an individual or a group of individuals the very right to exist, the right to exist peacefully in this world, can't be taken as a valid political ideology because it is inherently violent and it is inherently rooted in these very incredibly unethical mindsets and frameworks and value systems. So how can we have this underlying assumption of white supremacy and alt-right neo-Nazism as a valid political group or political ideology, and how can we not question that under this ethical framework?
Well, and what's so interesting too is I just looked up the definition of political, and it's relating to the government or the public affairs of a country. And I don't see, as Gray said, the denial of the right to existence of another group of people anywhere within that definition. So I think that that's such an important distinction to make, and I'm glad we're starting with that distinction, because I think that, from what I remember, that really heavily shaped our response to these questions and this issue.
Even if this was a political view, let's just assume for a second that, sure, white supremacy is just a political view, would it be okay to punch someone or respond with violence when faced with something that you personally disagree with. Wasn't there a quote somewhere about like politics is violence or something like that? Well, the point of government in general is to give people a framework for the society that they live in, and people participate in that government to have influence over their society or community. So if violence is a form of speech, I don't know. I'm not really sure where I'm going with any of this.
Well, Amalia, I mean, I do think there are some political views that you can respond to violence with, just to provide like a counter argument. And I think the main example that I would use would be any type of revolution. Because I feel like at a certain point, there's a breaking or a tipping point, however you'd want to say it, where a group of people has been oppressed that for so long that they don't have the access to this platform to kind of share their ideology in a peaceful manner, or they don't have access to the tools to kind of create this wide movement. And then when you hit that area of oppression where that's happening and there's a threat of violence against their lives or the lives of their families and immediate communities, they almost have, in my mind, have a right to fight back and defend themselves against an oppressive state. Now, obviously, if there becomes an issue of what's more strategic and what's more beneficial. Obviously, I mean, the civil rights movement is a perfect example of a peaceful movement and that rested in nonviolence. And I think their messaging and the way they banded together was inspiring. And obviously, it was very effective. I mean, it moved a lot of people. But then I also think that if you're in a very dire situation, is there a chance that violence could be more effective? You know, if your life is being threatened, is it always the best move to use nonviolence? Or could it sometimes be strategic to use violence to show power? I don't know.
Yeah. I think maybe there's a difference between the individual and collective violence when it comes to something like this, because it's true that the civil rights movement in the golden age or the golden era didn't use violence, but how successful were they truly? I mean, if we still have white supremacists today and we still live in, a culturally white dominated society, how sure they gave people of color in the United States more equal voting rights and voting access. They demanded an end to segregation, which we got, but outside of that, ideologically, did they win the battle when it comes to white supremacy? I'm not sure. So I think on an individual level, I think that if your life is being threatened, you are always justified in defending yourself, whatever that means to you. I think that it is important that people be able to defend themselves, especially if it's an attack that's on their identity or who they are as people. But I'm not sure.
I'd just like to take a step back a minute, because this is a really good point. I think we spent a lot of time talking about this, and we should expand upon it more. But I'd just like to take a step back and contextualize everything that we're talking about, because we're trying to bring in the civil rights movement. We're trying to bring in the modern attacks on people of color, and alluding to the Black Lives Matter movement, which honestly should have been brought up in the case instead of the Make Racists Afraid Again hats that were instead cited as the peak of anti-racism. It's really, I would like to almost bring it back and recenter us in the case, just to provide some context and a jumping off point, because I think Juliet, what you were talking about a community being oppressed for so long, the only logical recourse is to react violently. And this is really seen in the case where we might perceive the act of violence, in this case, the individual punching Richard Spencer. And Richard Spencer afterwards was quoted as saying, "Certainly some people think I'm not a human being and I can just be attacked at will." But that is ironic, considering his whole ideology is dehumanizing people of color, the LGBT community, anyone who doesn't ascribe to this specific vilifying, very, very destructive ideology. And so I think that we need to take a step back to contextualize this and to contextualize what violence is. Because violence, going back to what you said earlier, as politics is violence, policy can be violence. And we have a history of policy in the United States that is founded on white supremacy and founded on oppressing people of color. And so reducing that history and minimizing that history and only saying that this is a case of individual violence does a disservice to the history of the civil rights movement in this country that is perpetuating to this day.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at the kind of violence that existed at Charlottesville, like the kind of threats that were being made, like, not direct threats, but like ideological threats against people by white supremacists, the marching in the streets, chanting, and the white supremacist ideology. I mean, that was a kind of act of violence in itself against people. Like, what was that called? The example of not emotional violence, but
there's
like just mental violence?
Yeah, symbolic violence, taken back to that example of the KKK marching through a Jewish community sometime after World War II with that same kind of threatening and hateful symbolic protest. It is a violent act because it makes people live in fear and it makes people feel unsafe and threatened. And when people like Richard Spencer enable those views and allow people and give people the power to go out and do this and create this kind of harm to people, I think that responding with violence is completely understandable and logical in a way. It's saying that no, this kind of action is not okay. Your ideology has no place here, and it's trying to stave off the harm that is caused by his rhetoric. So I think it made sense in this case why people would respond with violence. And the violence caused against him wasn't that bad. Like, he got punched in the face one time by a random person who then ran away. Like, he didn't face, I'm sorry, I can't speak for him, but I can only assume that he didn't face any kind of long-lasting trauma. Like, he wasn't bleeding or anything. Like, he was fine. Like, it was fine. I'd say that he got off light compared to the kind of harm that was done to people by the mental image and hearing people marching in the street chanting that they shouldn't exist. So I don't know. I think
that comes to an interesting point of, like, is the violence itself justified, or should we value the long-term strategy? Because in the research we found that after being punched, Richard Spencer's following grew immensely because he was able to capitalize on the victimhood complex of the alt-right to specifically target generally young white boys on the internet who didn't feel like they were being seen in this age of, like, fighting for actual equity and equality. And so there was this question, this almost give and take of, is it the right thing to do in the moment, or should we instead value long-term strategy? Because that is how the radicalization of the alt-right occurs. It's when individuals don't feel like their voice is heard, even though historically their voice has been the only voice that has been heard. And then we see the burgeoning of violence within that ideology, and the numbing of empathy and the numbing of feeling things for other people that don't have the same lived experience as you. And so it's a really hard question to pass a moral or ethical judgment on, because there's so much history wound up in this one instance, this 45-second clip, that cannot be encompassed in a 6-minute conversation or even an hour-long conversation, what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, I mean, and I have a few things to say in response to your ideas as well as Amalia's. I mean, first, with the discussion of the violence of some of these alt-right groups and the rhetoric they're spreading, I'd almost classify that as a threat to cause violence, which I see as just as immoral as violence itself. like as direct, because if you look at violence as like physical contact harming another person, I think the rhetoric is a threat to cause that, which in some cases may even be worse than violence in itself, because it's creating that fear and that paranoia and that sense of just that constant fear of what may happen to you or your loved ones. So it's like, I think they're distinct. I think there's a difference, but I almost would say that the threat to cause violence is almost more immoral, because there's just spreading that kind of rhetoric can be severely damaging. So, but I think there is a distinction there between physical harm and harm that's spread through rhetoric.
Yeah, and this kind of threat is very unique because it's not a threat against one specific person. It's a threat against a people and a collective and a way of life. So it's indirect, but in some ways it's so much worse than a direct threat against a person.
It's almost like that the rhetoric is so normalized. It's not socially acceptable, but it is more acceptable than direct violence that causes physical harm or that leaves a physical mark.
Yeah.
I mean, and Amalia, you said like Richard Spencer didn't get that hurt, but like, where do we draw that line? Like, when is it too much? You know, because I'm not standing up for Richard Spencer. I honestly think that that punch, you know, it probably provided that person with momentary relief, and it made them feel like they were doing something. And while strategically probably not the best move, like what Gray said with him gaining followers, is at what point would it be too much? And I think another thing to clarify what we talked about in class was that when we're living in a system that's marked by violence, like if someone has been oppressed for the entirety of their life and violence has been used against them as a tool for their life, when they're responding in what others may deem to be a violent manner, arguably they're just reacting in the situation that they're giving. They're not the ones that initiated the violence. It's more self-defense. I know we watched an Angela Davis clip where she eloquently said that. We can probably find a way to share a link to that clip wherever we share this podcast. But the issue is when does that go too far? Like, would it ever be immoral to harm Richard Spencer in such an extreme way? Or is the fact that they're spreading this hateful rhetoric and this fear, does that level out some of the immorality associated with violence? And then also to consider what's the difference between violence against the state and reacting, like I said, with responding in self-defense to the violence that's been pressed against you, and physically harming one individual for what they've done.
Yeah, I think it's really, really complicated because this it's not an individual problem, it's a problem with an ideology. And the people who frequently buy into that ideology are in a multitude of ways victims themselves. Like, most people who take on white supremacist ideology are young white men who are feeling disconnected from the system, who are feeling angry and lost and depressed and don't know what else to do. So they take this and they channel all of this towards a specific set of people in a misdirected way. So it's hard to say that it would be okay to commit violence against those people who are themselves victims. But I think it changes when you're not just marching in the streets, when you are yourself committing like direct acts of violence. Like if you find people who committed who actually committed hate crimes, like I think it makes a lot more sense to react in a violent way towards them rather than just people who are misguided and lost and pick this up because it sounds to them like a kind of therapy group or a way for them to be in community with other people who feel like they do. So how would
that compare? How would that compare with violence against an oppressive state, like in a revolution? Is that more ethical?
I honestly don't think that is even really a possibility in this day and age, like grounding it in the United States.
Okay.
Because there is such a large military presence in this country, and there's such a large presence of armed actors of the state. And it would just be, I don't think it would be feasible for an armed revolution to even occur.
Well, I'm just speaking like hypothetically, right? Like if we're looking at if we're looking at someone responding, that's my main question is there a difference between violence directed towards an oppressive state because they've been using violence against you and that's your only way to break free of that, or a difference between an individual or a small group of individuals who may not be the ones in power but are contributing and adding to the hate and oppression and ignorance that's and they're causing it to spread.
Well, we sort of have
I think there's a huge difference.
Yeah, there's a difference, but there's sort of an example here in the LA riots in response to the beating of a black man by LA police officers, and footage of that went public and inspired rage across the black community of Los Angeles, and there were riots that led to millions and millions of dollars in damage. So that's a form of violence against the state, a kind of revolution towards maybe like what you're talking about, Juliet. I can't say that was a bad action to take. Like, lots of harm was done, but it made people sit up and listen and pay attention to the immoral actions and the messed up ideologies that people had in Los Angeles, the way that the government operated and treated people of color. So it's
so hard.
I can't say that that, it was, I think, not something that you can blame people for doing, and I think maybe even respect, because that the ultimate harm that will come for that is not to the state because it's so powerful, but to the people who themselves are rebelling. Like, you can't go on forever. Like, eventually your movement's going to get crushed and people are going to get killed and thrown in prison, and it's not going to work for you, but you still can respect that kind of movement, even if it's more or less futile.
And when discussing all of this, I think we have to bring up the universal principles of nonviolence and the argument that any violent act in and of itself is immoral. Just because we struggled with this a lot in trying to figure out where the line is drawn, and I don't personally think that any one individual can be the arbiter of a universal principle of either violence or nonviolence, but it is something to be said for having a principle of nonviolence that would encompass every individual in this situation. And I think that mindset would lead us to looking towards solutions that aren't founded in violence and that aren't founded in immediate reactions to the alt-right, to neo-Nazis, or to white nationalists in this country, but rather looking at the systems of education and systems of interaction in society that we have normalized, and maybe thinking critically about where the structures that educate people come into play, because we have so much access to information and technology right now. We have more access than ever before to learning from other people and to hearing so many different perspectives. And so I think we would have to have like a radical paradigm shift in educating, specifically in anti-racism, and educating in global understandings and empathy and connectedness, but we don't value that as a country. And historically, we as a country have been founded in principles of white supremacy, and so it would require undermining those systems that have been built up in such a way that would build strong foundations of togetherness, I guess.
Yeah.
The oceanic feeling.
Yeah. I mean, I do want to be careful, though, about saying that we don't value that as a country. I think that the power structures are not always set up for that to be valued, but I think there are a lot of people that would want to see that change.
Well,
yeah, I think there are a lot of people, but I think that we don't have the structures set up.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this very structurally, and that what we have established is not built to value connectedness, and isn't built to value learning and individual empowerment and empowerment within your own identity without looking towards any other individual or group to demonize them to make you feel good about yourself.
Yeah, you can, I mean, really pull out so far and look at this as a big picture and think about why we have, like, why racism is still a problem for us. Like something that people frequently come back to is say, like, hey, the civil rights movement happened, that was great. Like, racism isn't a problem anymore. Or why does this still exist if we had all of that and people thought it was so great and so inspiring that people made this kind of radical racial change? Like, why does it still exist? And the reason that racism, I think, still exists in this country is because it's like an ideological tool. I mean, this might be pretty far off base. It's a lot, but I think it's like an ideological tool that people use unconsciously or subconsciously or whatever to stay in power and to retain power. It goes into the reason why, as a country right now, we don't value workers, like why we're not set up in this time of coronavirus to take care of our most vulnerable, why we're not set up to value the people who work in our system above corporations themselves. Like, it goes really, really deep. Like, racism is just a tool of this ideology, and the people who feed into it, like the white supremacists, are also sort of a tool of this ideology. I don't know. This is a lot, but it seems to me like it's just kind of misdirection. Like, pay attention to the obvious violent people instead of paying attention to the people who are more quiet and the sources of all of this.
I mean, and I do, like, in my heart, I believe that if we were to have a leader in power that really wanted to make this happen, and with people around them in the government that wanted to make these structural changes, that it would be possible. And maybe that's me being very, like, I'm kind of a dreamer. That's just how I am. But I do, like, I have that belief that if we were to have the correct people in power who wanted to use that platform to lift other people up and actually create a nation where everybody can be actually free and share in resources and treat each other with respect, that some of these changes would be made. And I agree with Gray that a lot of it starts in education too, and learning how to kind of create communities where people can work together and understand their place and find a better sense of just, I guess, a community, like that interconnectedness that would benefit everybody. But I think that if it requires that awareness. And I agree with both of you that if you hold the belief that because we've had one movement that we're done, that's not really going to get us anywhere, right? It has to be a continuous push towards creating a better society for everyone.
I don't know. I'm really, really, really skeptical about that. Like, if people, if you're saying, like, if we wanted to make people free, if people were actually free, like truly free to be able to live and pursue paths that they cared about and were passionate about, we probably wouldn't have billionaires in this country, you know?
Like, but see, I don't know how I feel about that. That's where we get a little iffy.
No, but really though, like, the way that people accumulate wealth in this country is by acting unethically and by abusing other people's rights and liberties and freedoms. And if we lived in that society where we actually did value people, then it would not be the same society. Like, we're just not there yet. It's not possible. As long as we still allow people to accumulate massive amounts of wealth without limitation and ultimate freedom.
But here's the thing, Amalia. Wouldn't it be free to allow people to do that if that's what they pleased? Like, it's giving people the freedom. And I think that all billionaires... I think that I don't think all billionaires treat people unethically. I don't, and that's this is another conversation for our listeners out there. This is another conversation that we have quite frequently, because I think it's just
comes back to this.
Because I think it's the root difference between the three of us as a group, and I think it's interesting to explore that. I mean, I return to my all-time favorite billionaires to bring up, right? Like LeBron James and Bill Gates.
What about LeBron James and Bill Gates are very different people. Did you just say LeBron?
No, I was just saying your favorite billionaires. It's a funny sentence to me.
LeBron James and Bill Gates are very different people. I mean, Bill Gates is the head of a massive corporation, and LeBron James is basketball player. Basketball player. Like, one of them got their wealth by paying people less than what they're worth and using materials mined with unethical labor overseas. Like, it's not the same thing.
Fair. Let's just focus on LeBron then. Okay, LeBron James. He's the best. He is using his money to help people. And to me, I wouldn't say that just because you have a lot of money means that you've gotten it in an ethical way. I do think there are wealth inequalities that cause some people to have a platform or to be able to have an easier chance of becoming really wealthy. But I don't think that it's just because someone's got a large sum of money means that they've exploited people to get there. Again, that may be my optimism speaking.
Well, it's interesting bringing up a sports star, a sports legend, I guess. I don't know sports. But analyzing sports through a racialized lens and the history of like sanctioned, air quotes, opportunities for specifically black men in this country, sports being one of the only ones that are seen as legitimate by the white majority. And so even looking at sports as an example of an arena where men of color and black men in this country can... Yes, puns. But can achieve financial and monetary success is a really interesting example. And I don't really want to add too much more to this economic side of the conversation. Amalia said my piece. But I am thinking of perhaps a smaller change that may have to occur in society before we can address all of these issues that we're talking through, we're struggling through, and that we're not going to solve today. I was just thinking of our ability to be self-reflective and critical of our own selves. And so I think we have frameworks that don't align with being critical and being open and accepting of criticism and critical dialogue. And so that's something that I was worried about doing this podcast, personally.
I mean, I completely agree with you. It's scary to just talk and know that other people are going to listen, and some are going to agree with you and some are going to not. And then that fear of, criticizing something. I completely agree. I don't think we are equipped as a society to accept criticism as constructive and use it to either strengthen our case or maybe rethink something we said in the past. I couldn't agree more with what you just said, basically. I think it's important that we all think about how we can improve and accept criticism openly in the future.
This speaks a lot to the lack of education about race and racial justice across the country. This is a national organization, and the argument has been made that we should be just open and accepting of everyone's viewpoints because people come from different locations. And I think it is wonderful to hear different perspectives, but I believe that we have to come from a foundation of knowledge of racism and the history of white supremacy in this country, and not turn a blind eye to how we've got to where we're at, where neo-Nazism is alive and well, and where the alt-right actually has a name and is getting media attention, national media attention, and is being given legitimacy by, of all people, the President of the United States. And many people will disagree with that, but we're not all coming from a foundation of knowledge, and there is no one truth, right? There is no universal truth, but we do have historical truths that are suppressed in this country. And where do we draw that line between being, I don't think there is a line to be drawn in discussing white supremacy, but it feels like if we're trying to facilitate a conversation, it does a disservice to not have access to this kind of education. Do you understand where I'm trying to go with that?
I do. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and these are it's always a difficult conversation to have. And I think for the reason that we don't talk about it enough. And to me, I'm just kind of chuckling in my head now that it's interesting how the puncher was the one that the ethical dilemma surrounded. I mean,
Yeah.
what about the
God.
reporter who's recording this and posting it? What about Richard Spencer himself? I mean, there's so many other people that are engaged in ethical dilemmas here, but we're asked to decide whether someone should be allowed to punch somebody else.
Like, I to place blame.
And I think the blame is a big problem too, because even if we were to get to a scenario, a utopia, where we were able to tackle these issues and create an education system where, like Gray said, people were empowered to think critically and people were willing to accept how they had maybe wronged others in the past in a respectful manner, and people were able to kind of form this interconnected community, we would still have to avoid like placing blame on people, because there's so much that has happened that we have to kind of go back to where we can find commonality with one another and how we can redevelop respect.
There is a reason why most people don't learn deeply about racism in schools, why most people don't feel that themselves are qualified or capable to talk about this. Like, it's all there for a reason, and it's amazing, I think, that in this class and in this environment we're given a platform to be able to talk about it and to be able to really dig deep and try and break it down and figure things out. But it's frustrating that most places and most people don't have access to that, and unless people start getting access, then nothing is going, like, all this is irrelevant. Like, the white supremacists are still going to be there, and whatever you do, they're not going to go away as long as people are still indoctrinated into the society the way that they are today.
Well, I think this is a really good connection to the third question in the case. How should someone express their solidarity and support for those who oppose or are affected by bigotry? How, like, this question made a lot of assumptions about who was going to be answering this question, and it assumed that because affected by is a very interesting term to use in this conversation, and a lot of the semantics around this term center around privilege. And we came to the understanding that everyone is affected by bigotry, whether it's in a positive or negative manner. People are either supported, validated, legitimized by systems of oppression, or they are oppressed, they are invalidated, and exploited by systems of oppression. And how this question seemed to assume that someone who would be reading this case wouldn't have been in a similar situation. And I think it's a privilege for us as white students at Lincoln High School, it's a majority white school, to be able to talk about this freely with a decent understanding of knowledge, thanks to the efforts of wonderful teachers of color at Lincoln. It is a privilege to be able to have this conversation, and it is a privilege to not have had that, like, personal connection. And it is white privilege to be having this conversation in such a detached manner. We have to be well aware of that. But it is also a privilege within asking this question: how should you express your support for someone who's been affected by bigotry, in assuming that this question is even valid. And it also doesn't pay homage, again, I keep harping on about the history of, like, community action, community involvement, and like the history of this entire country.
The question also seems to imply that there's no use in trying to stop oppression or trying to push against it, that you just have to help those that are affected by it. Does that make sense? Like, it seemed very reactionary as opposed to let's see what we can do. But I also just want to interject really quickly. Obviously, we're students and we have a lot to learn. And that's why we're open to any comments, or if you all want to contribute anything to this discussion virtually, we have an email account that you can submit questions to. It's thegrayzonepodcasts@gmail.com. We'll put a link, or we'll put the email in the description. But I just wanted to say that obviously these are very difficult conversations to have, and we're students and we want to learn, and we're open to accepting that criticism that Gray was addressing earlier. So if you have anything that you would like to say or something you feel that wasn't mentioned, please let us know, and we'll do our best to respond to some of those comments and discuss them in a smaller episode later on. I just wanted to throw that in there. But continue on.
Yeah, we're not open to receiving criticism from white supremacists, but if you're not, we're open to a lot of criticism, but not in that way. It's interesting that it says affected by bigotry in general, like not just white supremacy, but also like, you know, sexism and homophobia and like xenophobia and all of that. It's not just bigotry.
Well, all of it is connected.
Yeah, you know, like you said,
we can isolate race, but we cannot isolate systems of oppression, I believe, because everything is interconnected and we're all functioning in these structures that exist based on ideologies that are there to create hierarchies and to create power differentials.
Yeah, like I don't believe that any of that is inherently too different from one another. Like you said, like all of these are coming from the same ideological systems. Like they all have common roots and they all have common purposes. And like you said, they do affect all of us in one way or another.
Are there any more points or questions that we should discuss?
There was the challenge. I mean, if you're going to go back to sort of the beginning about how do you deal with white supremacists, like it's incredibly challenging. Like there's no easy way to deal with the actual problems that we have now, as long as the ideological frameworks that create and support them are still in place. Like there was the organization that I mentioned that we all talked about earlier called what was it, Life After Hate, which is an organization that had federal funding, and their purpose was to try and provide a support network to people who were white supremacists, try and help them get out of that system, and basically like sort of therapy, try and help them come to a different path in life and correct their mistakes and right their wrongs, which sounds like a really great idea, and it sounds like it could do amazing things, but the problem is that they only were able to successfully reach and rehabilitate like 150 people total over the multiple years that they've been running, which just speaks to the incredible levels of difficulty of essentially deprogramming people and of realigning people's ideologies. Like there's like you can't really do much when it comes to this. Like you assaulting people, punching people, responding with violence, it only pushes them deeper into their little cave and only says yes, like to them, you're in the right, you are oppressed, like you are the victims of these minority peoples, like but if you try and help, it's a long and difficult and winding road to go down as well. Like it's such a complex system, and it's really, I think, sad for people who are trapped in that system, who don't have a way out, and who are probably just going to keep on going. It may be forever. I don't know. It's just things are hard out there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but I would say that 150 people is better than none.
Yeah, it's better than none, but it's not. Well,
then we have the fact that they were defunded by the federal government. They were receiving grants, and then those got taken away quite recently, wasn't it? And so
even less funding. I don't know.
Yeah, they are not being supported.
Less funding. And so, like, the organization can't reach more people if it doesn't have the funding to do so. And so, even if we are publicly denouncing the alt-right or white supremacist hate groups, because they have been denoted or designated by the FBI as a hate group, it's not the end-all be-all of saying that one group is a hate group, but it does add credence to the idea that the federal government should be providing funding towards actively working against hate groups, specifically domestic hate groups. So it's interesting how we can laud this organization for doing very good work and very difficult work in trying to deprogram white supremacists, but then turn around and question why we're not funding them in the first place. And I remembered what I was going to say earlier surrounding this whole piece of education and white privilege is that the questions in this case, the last question especially, seems to kind of call into question who has the moral obligation or responsibility to actually be doing the work to act against the alt-right or neo-Nazis or the hate groups that have been so pervasive in this country. And so is the question putting all of the responsibility on people of color? And is that's not okay, but is that where the question is leading us to go, is who is doing the work, right? And I've come to the thought process that in this education, in valuing education, and specifically valuing education and anti-racism, and learning the history of the United States that have got us to where we are today, with foundations of white supremacy, white people, specifically white people, have a moral obligation to do that work and to be actively involved in fighting back against hate groups and not monopolizing the conversation, which is very interesting to be talking about here today, where we're trying to work through this all. But like that moral obligation, who has that responsibility and obligation, was an interesting point of contention within this entire case that was not extrapolated on enough, I felt. And so like I believe that moral obligation like lies in white individuals who primarily like have that social or have that validation and that systemic power in getting elected in government, and then having a government or like a federal mouthpiece or a government sponsored mouthpiece, just statistically. And so like white people have to do the work to support people of color and not just take all the credit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, sense. I do think it has to be like an interconnected process. Like,
yeah,
it's got me thinking a lot about like
process.
Because it's got me thinking a lot about like intersectionality and the problems we're seeing right now with like white feminism. But that's a whole different issue. Amalia, were you going to say something?
Yeah, again, this just goes back to my point of how this is all kind of a little bit depressing, because unable to make change, we're asking the system to be self-reflective, and we're asking people to change their ideologies, like when it's not in people's benefit to do that, you know? Like if you speak out against this, even if you're in a position of power and privilege, you're not going to be rewarded for it. Like you're going to be taken down a notch and people aren't going to take you seriously. Like, yeah, it's just so incredibly hard. Like the people with the power don't want change, so how are we supposed to do anything if the power doesn't reside with us? Like, it's very, very convoluted and complicated. Like, unless enough people are educated about this and change their minds and decide that this is something that is important to them as human beings, like it's not going to happen.
I think
unless like it has to result from systematic change, but that is counterintuitive to the nature of the system. Like it's very paradoxical.
I do think it's all about who you elect and what you choose to support. Even if you're living in a community that wouldn't hold certain values that we're discussing to the highest level of importance, I think as individuals or community, just on a regular daily basis, there's things we can do to kind of encourage this change that we'd like to see in the world. And I don't think it has to be an impossible mountain to climb. I think it would take a lot of minds to change, and I think it would take a lot of people to reflect and be honest with themselves, which, as we've established, is not really the easiest thing to do. But I just think it really comes down to thoughtful consideration and then critically analyzing what we hear in the media about certain leaders and the information that we've gathered. Because clearly there's also a gap between the information you receive about who's in government based on which media source you're watching or how you're trying to learn information about everybody. So I think it just takes a critical analysis of multiple sources of information on who you're choosing to elect and place in these positions of power to really elect people who will create that change that you'd like to see. I mean, to me, if it's obviously a lot, there's a more of a history to it, but it reminds me in some circumstances to the climate change movement that's going on right now, because it's asking people to think critically on a regular basis about the choices they make and how those are contributing to the larger system that we're seeing. And it's in the same dynamic of the individuals can't fix it. It's not a small community problem that can fix the whole thing. It is systemic, and people need to work together and elect the right people to make it happen. But if everyone just starts thinking critically, that's like the most important first step. You know, I struggle to say that like it's so complicated and it's so that it's never going to happen. To me, I'm holding out that hope that we can start to become more accepting and more open-minded to sit down and have dialogues like the one we're having today. Because I know that I'll personally leave this and think a little bit more critically. You know, it happens. And so I think that's that first step. I don't think it's so impossible that there's no hope, you know? But that's just the way I'm looking at this.
Yeah. I don't know.
Julia,
Go ahead.
Okay. I hate to be a downer. I really, really appreciate an optimistic perspective, and I really appreciate trying to always center like hope and this community organizing. But even in bringing up voting rights and the climate crisis, those are two issues that are very, very different depending on if you're a person of color or if you are white. Voting specifically, if we say that, oh, you should just vote good leaders in, we see like widespread voter suppression and disenfranchisement that are specifically impacting communities of color across the country. And so again, this is that paradoxical problem that Amalia was talking about, where it wouldn't support the continuation of the current system to actively like act ethically and to ensure like that everyone has one vote, and that our system is truly listening to the voices of every single citizen in this country, because that would mean, like you were saying, voting people into office that we actually believe in. It's not to always try to bring it down, because that is the problem of always being critical, is that it's hard to see any solution and any hope and any goodness in the world, which I definitely recognize is a huge problem in falling into that trap of constant pessimism. But I think we have to just be very cognizant of the shortfalls of only relying on voting, or only relying on our elected officials, or only relying on one group of people or one organization to make change, because it would have to be multifaceted and multi-pronged in order to address every single issue. And we can't address every single issue. That's the conclusion that we so often come to.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the current presidential election, we did have a candidate who addressed a lot of these things, who did carry this very sort of populist, like humanitarian policy and ideology with a lot of support behind him from these marginalized groups. But we're not electing that person into office, you know? Like, we're going for people who are upholding the same system and upholding the same ideology as the ones that have always been in office. Like, we had an opportunity with this recent election and we didn't take it. So I think that the majority of people who are voting are not going to be voting in a selfless manner. People vote to uphold their own interests most of the time, and unless like Gray, your paradigm shift, unless something really radical and wild and unprecedented happens, like, I don't know. And I think that something good about this election was how popular the Sanders campaign got. I think that brought these problems to the forefront of a lot of American people's minds and made people think about things for a little bit critically, which is fantastic and amazing, but it just wasn't enough this time around to support the idea that people are going to do the right thing eventually. And
but I don't know. My thing is I struggle with the distinction between voting selflessly and not, because from my perspective, it's within all of our interests to create a more equitable society.
It's not, though. Like,
but I think it is. While some people may have to sacrifice their privilege in the short term, I think in the long term, creating an equitable society is within everybody's interest. At least that's my point of view. So I would vote for somebody who has that goal in mind, and I know they're going to do what they can to achieve it. I also think that yes, the voting suppression is an issue. So what has to start? Campaigns have to start to try to combat that. I know there are those happening right now, but we all need to think, like, again, I return to that thinking critically place. I'll think critically about what I'm doing right now that's either aiding the system or working against the system, and how I can work against the system to create a more equitable place, at least in my daily life, small changes I can make. And whether that's, looking for local organizations that are helping, end voter suppression, and maybe if I ever have a little bit of extra money, donating it to them or going to volunteer. I think it's just, each individual has to start chipping away at what they know they can to create wider change. And I just think that it's not, in my point of view, if we were to look at this holistically and look into the future, it's within all of our interests to create an equitable society, because that's where we all can thrive. It's not, the way it's working right now isn't really benefiting everyone. In fact, I think it's, even for the people who claim to be privileged from this outcome, it's not enriching their lives, and they're not living as human beings in an interconnected moral community, No. So I don't think it's actually, it may give people privileges in the material, and it may make people feel self-righteous, but I don't think that's actually a privilege. I think that's harming them and those around them, and I don't see that as a moral thing to really feel like you're benefiting from.
Yeah.
Just to throw that out there.
No, that's great, but it requires people to think logically and for the greater good of all people in their society to make that happen, and people aren't thinking that way right now. Like, I don't think that it's impossible, like, I really don't, but most people are just not being conditioned to think that way.
It's a shame.
Yeah. I think, gotta keep working on it, gotta keep chipping away, bringing up questions, making people think about things, giving people different frameworks, but it's really hard to do that when it's not in the majority interest, which it isn't right now. I think, did we solve racism, guys? I don't know.
No.
Are we?
No.
Nope.
Did we figure it out?
Of course not.
I think we tried.
It's good to talk about, though. I think it's important.
Yeah, it is the most important thing.
And maybe one person out there will listen to this and think a little bit differently in the next hour or so.
Yeah. No,
it's better than not.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think if anyone's listening to this and is intrigued, they absolutely need to just go out and do some research, do some reading, and maybe draw some new conclusions. Gray, got any closing remarks?
Felt like a beautiful place to end it.
That's pretty good. So is it okay to punch a Nazi? To take it back to the beginning?
Oh.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Yes and no. Guess what it is? It's a gray zone.
Oh my god. Don't even go there. Don't even go there.
Hey.
That's too meta. It's far too meta.
Yeah.
We exist to be meta.
Yeah. No, punch a white supremacist who's punching people. Don't punch a guy who is struggling through life, and question everything.
Punch Nazis and question everything. What a way to end it.
Yeah.
So that was this week's episode of The Gray Zone. Thank you for listening. If anyone has any comments or questions, as Juliet mentioned earlier, we have an email. You can email us, thegrayzonepodcast, plural, @gmail.com. It'll also be in the description. And we'll try to respond in our next segment or in another episode. And if you're interested in having these discussions more regularly, we invite you to have ethical discussions in your daily life. These cases are from the National High School Ethics Bowl. We encourage you to get involved. You can see if there's one at your school, or if you can start one, or just look at the cases in your free time. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you guys next time on The Gray Zone.